Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanity's Lunch and Learn program. For all of those of you who are regulars at the Lunch and Learn series, you will notice immediately that I am not Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. And thanks to so many of her hosting of Lunch and Learn series, the new Oprah. My name is Dr. Beth Greek-Palelli, and I am the Kurt Mayer Chair of Holocaust Studies at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington. I will be hosting the next 3 Lunch and Learn programs that are part of a series titled America and the Holocaust. Thank you to our community partners for supporting this series. A special thanks to the Powell Family Foundation, Nancy Powell, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, the University of Washington Communication Department, the Common Good Foundation. This program is being recorded and will be available on the Holocaust Center's website starting tomorrow. The idea for this series began with conversations at Pacific Lutheran University last year when no one had yet heard of COVID-19. We were planning the annual Powell-Heller Conference for Holocaust Education, and we decided it was time to address all of the complicating components of America and the country's reaction to Hitler's persecution of the Jewish community. The reactions ran from those who supported Hitler and his actions to those who did everything in their power to try to stop the Nazi regime. We were fortunate to begin this exploration last fall, thanks to the Seattle Holocaust Center for Humanity's Lunch and Learn series. And I encourage our listeners today to go back to the Holocaust Center's archives to watch our 3-part series from last October. This March, our Odyssey will continue, and over the next 3 Tuesdays, we will be presenting still more aspects of America's reaction to the Holocaust. Today's program focuses in on the issue of knowledge. What did the American public know about Nazi attacks against Jews? In particular, what type of coverage were the acts of discrimination and persecution of Jews in Germany and then later across Europe receiving in our American newspapers? And specifically, what exactly was the leading newspaper of the time, the New York Times, reporting? During World War II, the New York Times published over 1,800 detailed, timely stories about what was happening to Europe's Jews. Yet almost all of them appeared inside the newspaper. This raises the important question, why did the editors and owners of such an influential newspaper decide not to run these stories on the front pages of their paper? For most students of the Holocaust, we want to believe that had more Americans known and understood what was playing out for European Jewry at this dire time, that more people might have pressured the US government to intervene in immediate and meaningful ways in order to save more lives. Today's speaker, Dr. Laurel Leff, will address just that question. Dr. Leff has a master's in the study of law from Yale University and a master's in communication from the University of Miami. She received an AB from Princeton University with a major in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. She was formerly a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Miami Herald, and has served as an editor of the American Lawyer Media and the Hartford Courant. Dr. Leff is the professor of journalism and associate director of Jewish studies at Northeastern University in Boston. Her talk today will draw from her work titled Buried by the Times, the Holocaust and America's Most Important Newspaper. This book was chosen as the Best Media History Book of 2005 by the American Journalism Historians Association and Best History Book of 2005 by ForeWord Reviews. I would strongly encourage our audience members to also look at Dr. Leff's most recent book called Well Worth Saving: American Universities' Life and Death Decisions on Refugees from Nazi Europe, published by Yale University Press. This book was a finalist for a 2020 National Jewish Book Award. Dr. Leff is clearly no slouch, and let's just jump right in. Dr. Leff will respond to questions from our audience at the end of the program. I ask you to please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and you can type your questions in at any time. Thank you so much, Laurel, for being with us today. I'm going to hand it over directly to you.
Thank you very much, Beth. That was a very nice introduction. And I'm really happy to be here and happy that you're doing a whole series on America and the Holocaust. It's obviously what I do, what I'm interested in, but it's always nice to see when people are doing entire programs on it, because there are lots of different dimensions to it. But what I'm going to talk about today is how I came to do my work on the book that eventually became Buried by the Times, and then talk to you about what I found, and then try and extract some meaning from that, and ultimately conclude with one lesson that I think is pertinent to our current moment. So how did I come to do this? As Beth indicated in her introduction, I started off as a journalist, and I was working as an editor at the Hartford Courant in Connecticut, and I was teaching a beginning journalism class at a local college. And the textbook that was being used in this course happened to have a paragraph on a book that had just come out a decade before, called Beyond Belief: on Press Coverage of the Holocaust. And the paragraph said that there were all of these stories in American newspapers about what was happening to the Jews in Europe. And to be honest, I was surprised and very confused. Growing up, I had been taught, both in Sinai Temple's religious school and through the general culture, that Americans didn't know about the Holocaust until Americans liberated the concentration camps at the end of the war. But this was saying that there were stories in American newspapers. I then decided to go and read Beyond Belief, and another book called Abandonment of the Jews. And I learned from those two books that the American government, American Jewish groups, and American journalists knew quite a lot about the Holocaust as it was happening, and that much of that information found its way into the American press, although almost all of the articles were inside the newspaper. So that led me to two questions. The first might be a question I had as an American Jew, and the second might be a question I had as an American journalist. And the first question was, if so many news stories about the Holocaust were published in mainstream American press, how could I have been taught just 2 decades after it happened that Americans didn't know? I didn't understand. And then the second question that I had was, if so much information was available, why did American journalists not consider the Holocaust to be an important story? And just standard journalistic practice, if something is important, you put it on the front page. If it's not as important, you put it inside the newspaper. So why were American journalists deciding this wasn't an important story? So I decided to try and find the answers. First of all, by stopping being a working journalist and becoming a professor at Northeastern. But the approach that I decided to take was to look at one particular newspaper, and I chose the New York Times. And I chose one newspaper because, having worked in newspapers for, at that point, my entire professional life, it seemed to me that while broad social forces had an impact on what stories were in newspapers and how they were covered, a lot of the decisions were more idiosyncratic. It depended on who was the publisher, who were the editors, who were the reporters, how did they get along? So I thought the only way to really understand this topic was to look inside one news organization in particular. And I picked the New York Times because it was the New York Times, because then as now, it was the paper of record. It was very influential. If anything, it might have been more influential in the 1930s and 1940s, and particularly when it came to foreign news. It really was the only newspaper at that time with the reach and the interest in doing lots of foreign coverage. The other thing I knew about the New York Times was that it was owned by a Jewish family of German Jewish descent. And I didn't know what that would mean or how it would play out, but at least it seemed to me intriguing. Okay, so that's what I decided to do. And how did I do it? Well, what I decided to do, first of all, is just to see what was in the New York Times. And at that point, the New York Times was not digitized. So that meant I had to use the old-fashioned microfilm machines and look at every page of 2,555 newspapers, which was a lot of work and tedious. But I think in retrospect, it was actually good that I had to do it that way, because one of the things that it taught me was how hard it was to find these stories. I mean, that's where the title of my book, Buried by the Times, and the title of this lecture comes from, is the idea that these stories were there, but they were buried. And to sort of give you a little bit of a feel for it, and now I'm going to do the very dangerous thing of sharing my screen. Hopefully it'll all work fine. Okay, and let me just, one more thing. Hopefully you can see, there's my book, Buried by the Times, but that's not what I wanted to show you. What I wanted to show you was what the newspaper looked at the Times. Some of you may not even know what a newspaper looks like at all, even now, but for those of you who are familiar with the contemporary New York Times or the Seattle Times, Post-Dispatcher, what you'll notice here looking at the New York Times, and this is the April 22nd, 1943 issue, is that there are lots of stories. Now there might be 5 or 6 stories. Here there are 14 stories. That's pretty common. There's no photos. That was very uncommon, particularly on the front page. No graphics. I mean, nothing but sort of text. And inside it was even worse. And let me show you another inside newspaper. So this is from July 3rd, 1944. And as you can see, there are even more stories. There are 24 stories here because, let me show you, these little items here, these are all separate stories. So some of the stories that I'm talking about are like literally this big. Very hard to see. This is actually unusual in that it has some photos on it. That's less common. So I started looking at the New York Times, and again, every page on microfilm. I fast forwarded through the sports and the finance section, but basically I looked at every page. And what I found was that there were almost 1,200 stories about the Holocaust in the New York Times. And what do I mean by that? I mean stories about the discrimination, deportation, and ultimately destruction of Europe's Jews. But I also found, confirming what Deborah Lipstadt had said in Beyond Belief, was that all but 26 of those stories were inside the newspaper. And this is still, I mean, the detail and the timeliness and the information in these stories, I think, and the accuracy of these stories, I think, is still somewhat surprising to people. The myth that we didn't know that the Holocaust was a secret is so deeply embedded that it sometimes, I think, is hard to grasp how much information there was. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to describe to you some of these stories and let you see a few of them. I'm going to go fast through the slides. Probably won't have time for you to read what's actually in the stories, but if any of them strike you of interest and you want me to go back and we can look at the actual language that was used, I'm happy to do that. The first thing I need to say, though, in looking at these stories is it's not like there's going to be one story that says, here's the Holocaust happened, and then another story that says, here's the Holocaust happened. The Holocaust, like other historical events, unfolded over time. and in different places and in different ways. So what the journalists were reporting on were different things that were happening in different places as the Holocaust progressed. And I'm also going to divide this up into two time periods. One is from the beginning of the war in September 1939, and then ending in December of 1941. And for those of you who know American history, you know that in 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, is when the United States got involved in the war. The war was going on before that, but the United States wasn't involved. I should also say that my time period covered the beginning of the war to the end of the war. I did a little bit, beforehand, a little bit after just get a feel. But when I'm talking about almost 1,200 stories, it's just during the time of World War II. So during the first 2.5 years, what did I find? Well, the first thing is that there was all sorts of anti-Semitic legislation that was enacted in the countries that were occupied or allied with Germany, and intensified restrictions in the Reich itself. And here's a story that's sort of a culmination of this. What I'm going to show you is the page, and then we'll go to the specific story. But dozens and dozens of stories about all of these kinds of restrictions, and there had been previously in Germany. And then here you find this story, and it says, strolling bar to Jews in Berlin. So the idea here is, after all of these restrictions, now there's one that prevents Jews from actually strolling in Berlin. And what it says right here, after going through all of the specifications, is this last set of decrees reduces the rights of Jews to zero. They can only await deportation to the east, which every Reich Jew now realizes is his ultimate fate as soon as transport facilities are arranged. Okay, so there are those kinds of stories. Then the next kind of story, and you can see this here too. Again, you might need a glass in order to see this, but what happens is that there are stories about Jews being put in ghettos in Poland. There are 300 ghettos established in Poland, and there are stories about the creation of those ghettos. And as you'll see here, this is a story about the Warsaw Ghetto. Walls will enclose Warsaw Jews today. 500,000 begin new life in Nazi-built ghetto. So this story appears the day after the Warsaw Ghetto is sealed off. And again, dozens of stories about the ghettos. And then there are stories, as this one here, and again, we'll look at the page, note also the advertising. So you're reading about this in the midst of, sales of delicious foods. And the story is death rate soars in Polish ghettos. And what this story describes is the 300 ghettos in Poland. It talks about corpses being left out on the streets. It talks about the rations in the ghetto that is leading to massive starvation. It talks about the fact that children are no longer allocated milk, a lot of details. And again, this was, I'm showing you a sampling, but there are dozens of stories about this. And then, what you see now, then the next kind of type of story was the idea of Jews from other parts of Europe, the Reich, from France, from Belgium, from the Netherlands, being deported, being shipped to Poland, first to be in the ghettos, and then ultimately to the extermination centers. And this story here is kind of interesting. More Berlin Jews shipped to Poland. You can even tell from the way that this is not like, oh my God, Jews are being shipped to Poland. It's like, this is now a routine story. What's also interesting about this is that the reporter is actually watching the deportations. And at the very end, there's a paragraph that says that those Jews leaving the yard, and that means they've taken their family members, loved ones, to get in the trains. And the reporter is asks some questions, and then it says, those Jews leaving the yard showed few signs of emotion. One was asked whether the train was made up of passenger or freight cars. Casting a quick glance over his shoulder, he said, freight cars, but they are full of people. And then there are, dozens of stories, and from Vienna, from different places, from France. And speaking of France, one of the things that's going on in France is that the United States actually maintains relations with Vichy France longer than it does with Berlin. And so there are reporters in France up until November of 1942. They are actually invited into the internment centers that have been established for foreign Jews, along with photographers. So what you're seeing here is photographs that were taken in the Ghettos concentration or internment camp. Okay, so those are the first, so that's, the beginning of the events and the stories that are appearing in the New York Times up until 1941. What happens in 1942 is that the Germans decide that they are going to, instead of sending killing squads to kill Jews in the Soviet territories, for example, they are going to establish extermination centers in Poland and ship Jews from Poland and then from the rest of Europe to these extermination centers to be gassed. And these, Auschwitz and the Treblinka and the other ones begin operation at the beginning of 1942. And not too long after that, a few months after they begin operation, stories begin appearing in the New York Times. The first story is 2 paragraphs long. It's a tiny little story that basically says what's going on is the greatest mass slaughter in history. And then 3 days later, there's this story. 1 million Jews slain by Nazis, report said. And this is based on a joint press conference between the World Jewish Congress, the Polish government, and exile. Throughout the rest of 1942, there are about 10 stories describing where the killing is going on, how many people are being killed. In November, the United States State Department confirms that these murders, these deaths of millions of people are going on, and also indicate that this is part of a systematic plan, what we now sometimes call the final solution. And this is a very important date in the history of America and the Holocaust particularly, the 11 allied nations, which called themselves the United Nations at that point, including the United States and Great Britain, put out a declaration saying that basically 2 million Jews have been killed, 5 million Jews are threatened with extermination, describes where the killing is going on, the numbers of people being killed in these locations, and the various methods, including machine gunning and gassing. And this is coming from as confirmation of the extermination of the Jews. And I think for most historians, this is considered the point at which any kinds of doubts that there might have been that this was going on disappeared. As you can see, this did appear on the front page of the New York Times. But as you might also notice, it's not the lead story. This is a lead story. It's not a very big story. In fact, the only words that are in the Times language are the ones on the front. I'm going to take a look at the story here. And the rest is just quoting the text of the declaration. But that's at the end of 1942, and then there just continues to be a series of stories about talking about the rising death rate. 2 million Jews had been killed, then 3 million Jews had been killed, then 4 million Jews have been killed. There also are stories on what we would now consider to be some of the seminal events of the Holocaust. For example, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Here's another one of the front page stories. Remember, I told you were 6, you saw one. Here's another. This might be particularly hard to see. It's right here. And what it says is secret Polish radio asked aid is cut off. And it has the broadcast from the Warsaw Ghetto that says, the last 35,000 Jews in the ghetto at Warsaw have been condemned to execution. Warsaw, again, is echoing to musketry volleys. The people are murdered. Women and children defend themselves with their naked arms. Save us. And then what the Times and most of the other American newspapers do is they continue to cover the events in the Warsaw Ghetto, but inside the newspaper. That's the only front page story that is about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. You can see another story right here. And that's Jews last Standfeld 1,000 Nazis. There are also stories when the people of Denmark decide they're going to try and save their Jews by ferrying them across the river to Sweden. There are stories about that, about 7 or 8 stories about that. There are first-person accounts that are in the New York Times when, the Russians, after they beat the Germans at Stalingrad, they begin moving back through their territories that had been captured by the Germans, coming across sites of massacres. The New York Times reporter from the Moscow reporter actually speaks Russian, so he interviews a number of people, publishes their first-person accounts. And there are, and this is sort of the last of the slides I'm going to show you. Oops, I don't want to do that. Oops, here we go. Detailed accounts of the Auschwitz, as you can see here. Inquiry confirms that the death camp, very detailed accounts of Auschwitz, 2-part stories, both on page 3 and page 6 of the New York Times. So I think hopefully that will give you some feel for what the stories were like. Certainly as you get into 1944 and into 1945, what the stories begin to read like is, there had already been confirmation that 5 million to 6 million Jews had been killed. And then as soldiers and the reporters who were with them get to different countries, different towns, different cities, that are now completely empty of Jews, and that's the coverage of it. But what I want to do now, and so we're going to, I'm going to stop my screen sharing. Okay, is try and sort of say what this means, right? So if you have all of these stories, what does it mean about what Americans do and what Americans understood? And I think it's fair to say that if you read the New York Times very carefully, you would have had a pretty good idea what was happening to the Jews in Europe as it was happening. Now, I notice I said incredibly carefully because, as I've mentioned, I found 1,186 stories, although I have to say since then, since I did the counting for the book, I found a few others, again, showing you how hard it is to find all of the stories. So it's probably actually closer to 1,200. But, they're there. If you were reading the Times with that in mind, you probably could have figured it out. And as I would say, I think most of the stories are fairly timely, fairly detailed, and accurate. But again, almost all the stories were inside the newspaper. There are only 26 stories on the front page out of 2,400 front page stories. And of those 26, only 6 of them described on the front page the Jews as the primary victims. Oftentimes on the front page, they'll be grouped with other people who are suffering, and then only on the inside of the paper and that part of the story will it be clear that the Jews are being singled out. Similarly, there was never a lead. It was never a lead story. Even the liberation of the concentration camps in 1945, not the lead story, not the most important story of the day. Front page stories never followed each other one after another. I mean, usually the way you kind of build attention to a story, at least in the old print version days, was you'd have one front page story and then another front page story with big, huge headlines. That never happened. It was rarely editorialized about. The Times also then had an editorial page, printed about 17,000 editorials during World War II, and only 6 to 16 of them mentioned Jews in any capacity. It was about half that number that were actually talking about the killing of the Jews. It wasn't in the Week in Review, in the magazine, on a consistent basis. Nothing was done to call attention to the story. And I should say that the New York Times was more comprehensive than most newspapers. There were some that probably, made it more of a front page story, but then they had less information. The Times was really the one that was sort of carrying, every other day is what it comes to, some sort of story about the Holocaust. The only exception to that would be the Jewish press, I think for sort of obvious reasons, both the English language and the Yiddish language press in the United States, and liberal publications. The New Republic, The Nation, PM, which was an afternoon daily newspaper in New York, were more attuned to this story. But the pattern I found in the New York Times carries over to the rest of the American media. So the ultimate question is why? As I said, I didn't want to just document what was in the paper. I wanted to try and see if I could figure out what the decision-making was like. I would say, though, that some of the content analysis, some of the looking at the actual stories, dispelled some of the common explanations for the inside coverage. What was said, I think before Deborah Lipstadt's Beyond Belief and some of my work, the first thing that was said, as I sort of indicated in my introduction, was that the information wasn't available. Well, that's just flat out not true. It's just not true. I mean, you can't read these stories and come away saying, we had no idea. It was just vague. It was just rumors. That's just not right. The other was, well, maybe there were some stories, but they weren't really credible. You couldn't really trust the sources. So I looked very carefully at the sourcing on the story. And some of them did come from the World Jewish Congress and other Jewish organizations, which were supposedly biased. But a lot of the information came from governments in exile, the Polish government in exile, the Czech government in exile. And a lot of the information came from the Germans themselves, with the exception of the actual extermination campaign, the ghettoization, the discriminatory provisions, the deportations, all of that was sort of not hidden by the Germans. So, and if you read the stories, the sources aren't, you don't come away thinking, the reporter on this really didn't believe it. And part of the reason you can say that comfortably is because every now and then, and maybe a handful of stories, they do include some questions about the sourcing and whether it's credible. And that, to me at least, says the rest of the stories, they didn't believe that. And the last explanation, or there are two more explanations, but the third explanation, which I do think has some foundation, although you have to be careful about how you think about it, is that, well, the information might have been available, it might have been credible, but at some level it wasn't believable, right? You just couldn't, the public, the reporters, the editors couldn't accept the fact that the Germans were killing so many people in such horrific manner. And I think there's truth to that. I mean, I think we all still struggle with those kind of existential questions. How could it happen? But if you read the actual stories, they don't sound as if the reporters who are writing them or the editors that are editing them doubt the believability of the stories. And let me give you just two quick examples. Both of these come from the period in 1944, after the Germans have moved into Hungary. Hungary is the last intact Jewish community in Europe. The Germans decide, because they can't and aren't winning the war against the Allies, they can at least win the war against the Jews. And so they decide to start deporting the Hungarian Jews. There are about 800,000 of them immediately, to be gassed immediately in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And this first story on this appears in the New York Times on May 10th, 1944. And I'm going to read you just the lead of this story. Although it may sound unbelievable, it is a fact that Hungary, where Jewish citizens were comparatively well treated until March 19, is now preparing for the annihilation of Hungarian Jews by the most fiendish methods. The puppet Nazi government is completing plans and about to start the extermination of about 1 million human beings. The story then goes on to say they are to meet the same fate as more than 5 million Jews who have been, in quotes, put to death in one form or another by the Germans, including in gas chamber baths. And that story appeared on page 5 of the New York Times. In fact, all of the stories about the destruction of Hungarian Jewry appeared on page 5 of the New York Times. And then the last explanation for, that sort of was common explanation, was that yes, these were stories, but there was a war going on. The war news was the most important. It sort of crowded out everything else. And certainly the war was the most important story. It was to save civilization. And that should have and did receive the most prominent coverage. But looking at every one of these pages of these 2,555 newspapers, what you discover pretty quickly is while they did, cover the war extensively, probably on a typical day, half of the newspaper would be devoted to stories about the progress of the war. About half the stories didn't, right? It wasn't literally being crowded out. There was literal space. It was just not deemed important enough. So why wasn't it important enough? And this is where we're coming to the end here. And here you have to, I think, distinguish between the American press generally and the New York Times in particular. For the American press generally, I think it was just always considered to be a secondary story. It involved a foreign minority group that the editors assumed most Americans didn't care very much about. So it should be covered, right? It should be in the paper, but not given a lot of attention, particularly as American sons were fighting and dying in the Pacific or in North Africa. So it was basically, this was a story outside the sphere of concern of most American newspapers. That, however, was not true of the New York Times. Half the Jews in America lived in the Times circulation area. Many of them read the Times. Half of the Jews who lived in the New York area were foreign born, were born in Eastern Europe or Central Europe. So it was, in fact, their mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and uncles and aunts who were being marched into the gas chambers. This was not some distant foreign other for a large part of the New York Times's audience. Also, as getting back to it, the New York Times was owned by Jews, by a Jewish family, and had many Jewish editors and Jewish reporters. So what explains these actions on part of the New York Times? I think there are a couple. I think the irony and the tragedy is the fact that the New York Times was owned by a Jewish family made them more inclined to downplay the story, so they wouldn't look as if they were engaged in what was then called special pleading on behalf of a minority group that they were a member of. They didn't want it to look as if, because they were Jews, they were giving attention to what was happening to the Jews, so they significantly downplayed the story. And then the publisher of the Times, a man named Arthur Sulzberger, he was very concerned about the Times being considered a Jewish newspaper. He thought it would hurt the credibility, so the concerns about special pleading also became part of his personal identity dynamic. As a philosophical matter, he also adhered to a view of Judaism that Judaism was just about being religious. It didn't have anything to do with an ethnic identity or a sense of peoplehood. So anything that described Jews in a way other than they went to synagogue on Saturday rather than to church on Sunday, he considered illegitimate. Jews were not that kind of group. That also made him significantly an anti-Zionist. He was very opposed to any kind of Jewish state, particularly one in Palestine. And when most of the Jewish organizations began pushing for a greater number of Jews to be allowed into what was then British Mandate Palestine, he got into very public fights with the leaders of the major Jewish organizations on that issue. And I think it colored his view of other issues. So those are my explanations. I can, obviously talk about them in more detail if you're interested. But I think the importance is not only did the Times downplay the story, but I think it also sort of reverberated back to other American newspapers with the assumption that if the New York Times which was owned by Jews, didn't consider this to be an important story. Why should they? And the way I want to conclude is just talking about, I think, one of the things I've been thinking about sort of in our current moment, which is how difficult it has been to grasp how many people have died of COVID over the last year. You know, we struggle with the numbers. And so, you know, the Times too has sort of been struggling with how do we illustrate, you know, 100,000 deaths, 500,000 deaths. And you might remember back in June, what the Times did was it devoted the entire front page to printing the names of people who had died of COVID. And at that point it was 100,000, and they actually could only fit 1,000 on the front page. So when I saw that, you know, I was thinking, but the idea was it's important for people to understand what these numbers mean. And I thought back and, you know, had the Times in the 1940s tried to in some way get their audience, get their fellow journalists to understand what the numbers of deaths of Jews in Europe meant. But then I quickly realized, you know, to do that would not just be one front page story. It would have meant that every issue of every newspaper during the war, they would have had to devote 3 full pages to the number of deaths, because that's what it means to ultimately lose 6 million people. And if the Times, you know, had done that during the Holocaust, I don't know if it would have made a difference, but I do know that they should have tried. Thank you.
Laurel, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And I can see that we had so many questions rolling into the Q&A and the chat. So I'm going to try to group many of the questions. And I think some of them you've already kind of touched on and given some insight into, but it'll give you an opportunity to elaborate a little bit more. One of the questions that rolled in, it was actually from one of my students. So yay.
Even better, yeah. I didn't tell my students about this. Maybe I should have.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating thing to see what questions they come up with. And this was one of the questions that I would have had for you too. And could you maybe elaborate on the general kind of feeling, the mood in America, anti-Semitism of the time, and how much of a role did the contemporary anti-Semitic attitudes in America influence what went into the paper, and again, what the owner of the paper would have been aware of at this point in time?
Yeah, so the owner of the New York Times, the publisher, was a man named Arthur Sulzberger. And I think, you know, he was a smart man, and he certainly understood the dynamics of anti-Semitism, but he was in a pretty privileged position. I mean, not only was he the publisher of the New York Times, but, you know, he'd gone to Columbia, they lived in a beautiful apartment, they had family wealth. I don't think that he was concerned about anti-Semitism, obviously, but I don't think it directly affected his decision-making, except in the way that I talked about, which was less about, you know, fear for their lives or fear of the sort of anti-Semitic hordes, fear in the sense of maybe losing some prestige, of not having the status that he wanted to have, of being too overly identified as a Jew. And I think that was, at least among elites, that was much more of a concern than a sort of gut level anti-Semitism, which did exist in society, obviously. But I think, you know, one of the things I'm coming to in my study, both of the Times and of American universities, is how fierce the elite anti-Semitism was. So, you know, I almost put more blame on the State Department and the people in the State Department and the people around Roosevelt than I do necessarily on the general public, who I think wasn't really even given a chance to know enough to know how they might respond to what was happening in Europe.
Excellent. Well, and I think related to that question, a person had typed in asking about the role of Rabbi Weiss, Stephen Weiss, and if you could maybe elaborate on his relationship. Did he have a relationship with the publisher of the Times? Was he also maybe adding his opinions about, well, how much coverage should there be of this particular question? Can you comment on that for us?
Sure. Yeah, I looked very carefully. Rabbi Weiss, who was both, the rabbi of what was then called the Free Synagogue, it's now called Stephen S. Weiss Synagogue in New York, was a very influential Reform rabbi. He was head of the American Jewish Congress. During this period, he also became head of the World Jewish Congress, which was an umbrella organization for different organizations in different countries. And of course, the United States was really the only safe place to be. So, and the World Jewish Congress, and he had a very important role because they were probably the primary American organization that was trying to do something to advocate on behalf of the Jews in Europe. And part of that was to turn their attention to the press and to the New York Times. And it was something they were interested in doing. I think that there were, one of the problems that what World Jewish Congress had was they sort of assumed that if they could just confirm the information, that was the obstacle. So in 1942, when the news was first coming out, Weiss devoted his attention to trying to get the State Department to confirm the news, which they ultimately did, to get the United Nations, the 11 allied countries to confirm it and put out a declaration. And they assumed that would be the breakthrough, right? That point, then they would treat the story the way it deserved to be treated. But that didn't happen. And probably the best example I have of this is that, first of all, the following day, there's no story. The following day, there's no story. The following day, there's no story. There's then at the end of December, there's an inside story. So the World Jewish Congress decides that what they need to do is they need another sort of blockbuster kind of story. So one of the things that had happened was a group of Polish Jews had been allowed to leave Poland and go to Palestine in exchange from Germans who were in Palestine. So they get to Palestine, they give affidavits to the Jewish agencies there, and the World Jewish Congress then prepares this very detailed story with the affidavits, personal accounts. They're so sort of convinced this is an important hot story that they give it to the news organizations a week ahead of time and say that you're embargoed on this. We'll give, nobody can use it until a week. You can confirm, you can do whatever you need to do to make sure this story is good. And the New York Times ran the story on page 37. Oh. And that sort of meant that this breakthrough moment wasn't really happening. Now, Weiss and Sulzberger did not get along at all. And in fact, when I talked about the fights that Sulzberger had with leaders of the American Jewish community, I was thinking of Weiss among others. And their literal fighting, though, tended to be more about Zionism and indirectly about what that meant for saving Jews than it was they were fighting about saving Jews. But they had a very antagonistic, and always had since the 30s, they had a very antagonistic relationship, which probably didn't help in terms of convincing the Times to play out this story more. Yeah.
Well, and that's fascinating just to think about how the personal becomes the political, right? That because of this lack of a friendship, a lack of a relationship, that might play a role as well. I want to also pivot. There were several people who were typing in, and I think this probably overlaps with the idea of after all of your research, does this make you very cynical, right? Because many of the questions are saying, the lack of the New York Times having editorials about what was going on, the lack of the coverage being frontline, front page, big font, let's really call attention to it, let's put a photograph to it. Many people that are typing in want to know about your opinion about the culpability. How did the paper fail use its leverage to try to change American policy. There are many people typing in about kind of current events, about Uyghurs, the Rohingya, the situation in Syria and Yemen. So maybe if you could kind of talk a little bit about, our expectations of what a paper and what they could actually do.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think my criticism is at a level even before that, meaning what I would expect of the New York Times, especially the New York Times of that era. I mean, there was a real difference between journalism then and journalism now in terms of how a paper like the Times thought it could engage in what they then called campaigns, right? Take on certain issues. And they did some of that. So again, I don't want to be, too much like, of course they would never do that. They did some of that, but that was sort of fairly unusual. It was much more an era of sort of objective journalism. But I think the Times failed on that level too. I mean, I think if you had just said, how important is this story in relation to other stories, you would have put more stories on the front page. I mean, in doing this work, I would often, because I was an editor, just before this, I'd been an editor, and I would literally say, like, what would I do with this story? If I was sitting in the New York Times, of course, they'd never harmed me as a woman, but that's another story. But if I was sitting there in, the 1940s, and the story about them not allowing Jews to stroll in Berlin, that's often the one I give, because it's not sort of super dramatic in some ways, but it's like, you've been writing these stories for almost 10 years now. Right. Isn't this is the culmination? Put the story on the front page, and they didn't. Right. Yeah. So it's really it's even less of a, why weren't they advocating? It's more like, why weren't they just treating the story they would if they considered this to be any kind of an important group. And I think now there are all sorts of other kinds of reasons why these stories don't get the coverage that we think that they deserve. One of it is just the state of American journalism now, which is that, it's very, newspapers that used to have foreign bureaus and people covering things in different places can't afford that anymore. Even the Times and the Post, Washington Post, who've done that historically, haven't. So, there are other kinds of complications now, but my fault is less on they didn't do a good advocacy job as they didn't do a good journalism job.
Okay, well, and that relates, maybe we have time for just one or two more questions before we have to kind of wrap things up. Many people have been also kind of curious about editorial cartoons. Were no cartoons?
Times didn't run them.
Oh, okay. So
they just didn't do it.
They didn't do it. Okay, so that's an easy.
They were too staid for that kind of thing. I mean, there were some, we're talking about Dr. Seuss now, but Ted Geisel, actually, the Dr. Seuss worked for PM, the liberal newspaper I talked about, and he did some cartooning on this, but not in the New York Times.
Well, and that was related to one of the other questions that many people are saying. Didn't any other major newspapers or magazines try to get this information out? And then related to this, I don't know if this is too far afield from you. One person did ask about radio coverage, and I don't know if you can comment on radio.
I did. I actually just did a piece on Edward R Murrow. That appeared in something called American Journalism, where I looked at his radio coverage and some of the other general coverages. So maybe I'll start with radio.
That would be fantastic.
So, someone did a study of this maybe 20 years ago, the easiest thing to say is somebody should look at it more in depth.
Right.
The reason I and they found sort of the same pattern. So numbers of stories, but not leading broadcasts, not a lot of consistency and coverage. The reason that I looked at Murrow in particular is, again, in the same way, like if anyone was going to do it, it would have been the New York Times. It was like, if anyone was going to do it, it was going to be Edward R Murrow. Right. And not just because he was the pinnacle of American journalism and someone, with a real soul and an interest in moral issues, but he had a special connection, which I had only found when I did my second book about refugee scholars. His first job out of college, was working for a group that tried to place Jewish scholars who'd been fired from their positions into American universities. And he did that for about 2 years, and then he went off to CBS, but he maintained a lot of contacts with the people in the refugee organization and with refugee organizations in London, where ultimately he's based. He's moved from New York to London at the beginning of when the Germans moved into Austria. And so it's like, and, he did this very moving broadcast from Buchenwald at the end of the war. Right. So it's like, where are you, Edward R Murrow? Yeah. And he's not, he does one very dramatic broadcast, besides the Buchenwald one, about the time of the confirmation of the Allies' confirmation of the news, where he, lays it all out, a lot of detail, tells people, you have to believe this, there's no doubt about it. And then that's it until Buchenwald. He just never followed through. He was head of a team of reporters at CBS, radio reporters that were sort of pioneering radio journalism. He didn't have his team do the stories. Right. He, like the president, FDR, was not very good about putting down his thoughts. He didn't keep a journal, he didn't keep a diary. So there's nothing to sort of say why exactly. But he certainly, in the same way that Sulzberger knew, he certainly had a really good feel for what was happening and never did anything. I was very disappointed.
I don't know. Somehow we got I can see in the chat box that people are typing in that they're very sad about. And I was very sad about it too. Yeah, I don't know that there's any way to bring people's hopes back up again, right? Other than that, the press was they were reporting it, but as you said, it would only take a person who's a very careful reader and a really dedicated, methodical reader to piece all of these stories that are so deeply, buried into the back pages in some cases. So
I had a moving example of that when I first started doing this, and I did an article before I did my book, and I got an email from a student in Pennsylvania who said that his grandmother had just died. They were going through things in her attic, and she had a shoebox of stories, and her husband had actually been in Europe at the time, so she went through the New York Times and cut out every story about what was happening to the Jews in Europe, put them in this shoebox, and saved them for 60 years, right? Wow. So if you cared, this is kind of if you cared, you would know, you might try and do something, but if you didn't care, if it was happening to somebody else, it was happening to a foreign group that you didn't like particularly much, then you didn't know, you couldn't do anything. It starts with, and I think this is what is true for me in sort of contemporary journalism too, is it starts with caring, and you work back from caring. Yeah. Some people can be brought to care, but it really starts, this is something that means something to me, I'm going to devote myself to it. And then whether you're Rabbi Weiss or you're somebody who's trying to do some kind of rescue, or a journalist, and there were a few lower level journalists at the times who were trying and not being paid attention to. And I've learned a little bit more about some of those people than from when I wrote the book, because at the time I did it, it was very hard, even with the beginnings of the internet, to connect with people. And now it's a lot easier to connect with people. So some of the children and grandchildren of some of these reporters got in touch with me. And so I've learned more about them and what they wanted to do and their interests. But, they were really sort of lower level discredited. They were not stars at the New York Times. They were the Jerusalem correspondent or the Bucharest correspondent, or, something like that.
Well, Laurel, thank you so much for this presentation. And I think at the very least, people have learned so much. It's been very eye-opening. And I can see pouring in over the chat, so many people typing in thank yous. It's a wonderful topic, and it really is so riveting. So I just
want to say one other just really quick thing, which is, now the New York Times is digitized. So if you want to sort of, look at these, I mean, you can only really be persuaded of this if you actually read the stories. And so if anyone either has doubts about what I'm saying or has like, I want more details, you can really you could do a search, you could do Jews, you could do camps. I mean, there are a couple of words and then you can start reading these stories.
Which would be a much easier task than what you had to do back in
the day. But again, I'm glad I had to look at the stupid.
Yes, yeah, where you go blind. if you didn't have glasses before that research, I guess.
No, I did third grade,
you
but
had to. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks to everybody and for your interest.
Thank you so much, Laurel, and thank you to all of our participants for joining in today's program. I'd like to say another shout out, thank you to the community partners who supported today's program, the Powell Family Foundation, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, the University of Washington Communication Department, the Common Good Foundation. This program has been recorded and you'll find it on the Seattle Holocaust Center for Humanities website starting tomorrow, along with all the other past Lunch and Learn presentations. As everyone watching knows, it takes a dedicated team to keep the Holocaust Center running at full speed with virtual presentations. And I'd like to give my special thanks to Richard Green, Museum and Technology Director, who's been running all of the technical side of the show. My thanks go to Ilana Cohn-Kennedy, the original Oprah of all of the programming, and who lets me occasionally step in. I can't thank her enough for that opportunity. My thanks also to the Executive Director of the Holocaust Center, Dee Simon, who has invited Pacific Lutheran University Holocaust and Genocide Studies program to organize this series. I encourage you to join us next Tuesday for the second part of our series. And also I'd like to put in a plug for a Yom HaShoah Holocaust Remembrance Ceremony on April 8th. We will be featuring Ingrid and Maud, who met briefly as children in the Netherlands when Ingrid's family helped to hide Maud and her sister. As part of this program on Thursday, April 8th, we will have an all-community candle lighting ceremony. Bring a candle, turn on your camera, and join us as we mark this day of remembrance. More information and registration can be found at holocaustcenterseattle.org. Thank you again.